In this section, you're going to learn about what safeguarding means and what it covers. So firstly, we're going to look at a definition of safeguarding. So broadly speaking, safeguarding can be defined as a legal duty of care to actively protect children, young adults and vulnerable adults from the risk of or the occurrence of significant harm and abuse. To begin with, we're going to look at some of the different types of abuse. There are 8 categories of abuse, and the definitions of what constitutes this abuse can be seen on the table. If we also take a look at some statistics from the National Statistics Office and the NSPCC, we can see that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys under the age of 18 will suffer sexual abuse. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will experience domestic violence or physical abuse. Nearly 44,500 people were victims of hate crimes, either due to disability, race, religion, or sexual orientation. In 2015, the NSPCC recorded 4,000 children requesting counselling for cyberbullying. Abuse isn't something that happens to other people. Abuse can happen to anybody, and anybody can be an abuser. As just mentioned, anybody could be at risk of abuse. However, there are certain identifiable factors which can increase the vulnerability of somebody to being abused. Risk factors include having a disability or a learning difficulty, being bullied, feeling isolated or having low self-esteem, being older or younger, and having a mental health problem. All of these factors can make them easy victims for abusers. As a language college, we have students who come from different countries, and this in itself could make them feel more vulnerable than usual. Many of them are alone in the UK and so can become isolated. Lots of our students don't speak English well and possibly don't understand our culture particularly well, and this can lead them to having feelings of low self-esteem as they can't communicate as effectively as they would do in their own country. This doesn't mean that all our students are at risk of being abused. However, we do need to consider the possibility that they may be more vulnerable than they would be normally at home. We're going to look at some of the warning signs that can indicate somebody is experiencing abuse. The warning signs can be split into physical or psychological or behavioural. While some of the signs are obviously connected to particular types of abuse, for example, physical injuries such as bruising or burns or cuts are probably a clear indication that physical abuse is being experienced. However, it's important to remember that signs such as physical injuries are unlikely to be noticed by you, as people tend to feel extremely ashamed and cover them up with clothing. What you're really looking for are more subtle signs. It could be that somebody is being aggressive without provocation. They could be absent a lot of the time due to sickness but haven't declared any medical reasons for being sick. They possibly could begin to smell of alcohol if they're using this as a way of coping. Many of these things could just be down to personality or due to a person's normal lifestyle. However, if you notice any of the symptoms that are described on the table, then you really should report them and be concerned by them. So before we move on to look at the 3 main areas covered by safeguarding, let's just recap on what safeguarding means and what we've learnt so far. So safeguarding is about, firstly, protecting people, understanding what the different types of abuse are, learning to recognise the signs of abuse, remembering that anyone can be an abuser, and most importantly, remembering that any abuse has a damaging and lasting effect on victims. There are three main areas which are covered by safeguarding. First is safeguarding children. A child can be defined as anybody who is under the age of 18. There are various pieces of legislation and government policy which relate to the safeguarding of children. The first is the Children's Act, which was passed in 1989. Keeping children safe in education, which provides guidance to any schools and colleges in how to uphold safeguarding duties. And working together to safeguard children, which is intended to improve communication between educational and statutory services in the protection of children. The second area of safeguarding relates to the protection of vulnerable adults. Adults who are considered to be vulnerable are those who have a mental health problem or a mental illness, somebody who has a disability or a learning difficulty, a person who's dependent upon drugs or alcohol, people who are elderly or considered to be frail due to a physical illness, and people who are at risk of homelessness. The main piece of legislation which relates to vulnerable adults is the Care Act, which was passed in 2014, outlining the responsibilities of institutions in regards to protecting adults from risk of abuse. The third and final area we're going to look at is protecting people against radicalisation and extremism. There is a twofold approach to this. Firstly, being aware of who can be vulnerable to indoctrination by extremist or radical groups and what the warning signs are. So in terms of looking at the risk factors, they are the same as we discussed earlier. So for example, someone who has a mental health problem, someone who is being bullied, people who feel isolated, and also people who feel marginalised. Again, many of the warning signs are similar to those discussed for any type of abuse. However, some are more common in this area. So, for example, an increase in aggression, expressing views which most people would take as being extreme or violent, withdrawing from society or normal friendship groups, and changes in the way somebody dresses. The second part of the approach is to promote British values within curricula in schools and colleges. In broad terms, this means promoting the fact that we're an equal but diverse society that's made up by many different races, religions, cultures, and also lifestyles, and that we're a tolerant society so that people are free to live their lives in the way they choose without being at risk of victimisation or hate. The main legislation covering this is the government's Prevent strategy, which is part of the Counter-Terrorism Act. The Channel Duty Guidance outlines responsibilities for care, education systems and public services in how to counteract the risk of terrorism. Terrorism does not necessarily mean religious, it means any extremist or radical group. So that's the end of section 1. There are some questions for you to answer before you move on to section 2.